day before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man identifying himself as Dan Cooper bought a plane ticket from Portland to Seattle. He hijacked the plane, claiming he had a bomb in his briefcase, and demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He jumped out of the plane with the money and the bomb somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, never to be seen again. The FBI claims to have investigated over 1,000 people, including dozens of deathbed confessions. In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI suspended its investigation of the case. While the FBI is no longer looking for D.B. Cooper, there is a community of people who are trying to solve the case on their own. Welcome to the Cooper Vortex.
Lisa Story is an accredited communications professional and badass epee fencer. She spent much of the last 7 years researching and writing about Walt Reca after he handed her a written confession explaining how he hijacked Flight 305. But most importantly, he told her he committed the skyjacking because he believed he was better off dead than poor. Ladies and gentlemen, my good friend, Lisa Story.
Lisa, how was CooperCon?
It was really interesting, a lot of fun. I met great people, learned a little bit more, found more details that I think support our story that Walt Reca is D.B. Cooper. But I also found the people involved, the fans, the people who are behind the story, to be very enthusiastic, but also open to different ideas. I had one gentleman sit next to me one night and talk about, well, maybe this happened, because he liked my uncle's story, but he also had a problem with it. So he was trying to help me come up with an alternate reason that, this fact doesn't quite match up with some of the details. So I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed meeting people. I met a couple from New Jersey who just flew all the way across the country for this as a nice break. And they were wonderful. They were a lot of fun to talk to. And then I met a very nice couple from Wyoming, and they threw a bombshell at me the last day and told me that the woman told me she had used a false name and that she was actually McCoy's daughter. So we had I found her to be just such a really lovely person and interesting person. And her story, while she does believe her father was Cooper herself, and he was the gentleman that did like a copycat hijacking 6 months later or 5 months later and was captured and killed by the FBI. She just has such, there's a lot of tragedy around her story and then what she had to deal with growing up. And so I think from a fan perspective, sometimes people forget that there were victims in this crime. And I talk about my uncle because I'm really, his story is so interesting, and I know him in a different way than obviously the Flight 305 crew knows him. So
one of my favorite parts of CooperCon is you were on the suspect panel, yes. Hilariously seated right next to Marla. So it was these two blonde gals who both claimed D.B. Cooper was their uncle. But yes. On that panel, you had a brilliant answer when I asked the question to everyone. What would you do if the case gets solved tomorrow and it's not your guy? And you immediately said, I'd be pissed.
Yes. And a lot of people came up to me afterwards and really appreciated that. And I think the reason I said that is my uncle's story is so interesting. And McCoy's daughter and I talked about this as well. All of the major suspects in and of themselves are very interesting human beings. I could have really pursued, as obviously I've been spending the last 7 or 8 years writing a book about him, and I'm close to releasing it. It'll be self-published. I don't doubt anybody but my family will read it. But
I'll read it.
Oh, good. Well, I'll send you a signed copy. I could have really focused more on his Middle East years and his mercenary work than the whole hijacking. I've spent so much time focusing on that aspect of his life and tying the story together, that it, I don't think I would have finished the story. And maybe that's part of what it is too. Maybe if I didn't think he was Cooper, I would have thrown all his papers away. I would have never looked at some of his letters, some of his passports and IDs, and found out that he was in the U.S. Foreign Service a couple times. And I think maybe this forced me to do his story, which is interesting in and of itself, whether or not you think he's Cooper or not.
All right, let's start from the beginning here.
Okay.
When was the first time you heard the words D.B. Cooper?
So the first time I heard of D.B. Cooper was sometime along, my adulthood. I'd heard about it. I was not a big fan of the story or that much interesting. I never paid attention to different suspects. But the first time I really started to look into it was my uncle's best friend, Carl Lauren, had been writing a book about my uncle because he had such an interesting life in his Middle East years. And he had also spent some time off and on in Sierra Leone, mining for diamonds and trying to sneak them out dressed as a Catholic priest. So Carl was writing a book. And as Carl will tell you, and his wife will tell you, they both knew Walt was D.B. Cooper the night of the hijacking. So when Carl started meeting back up with my uncle in the year 2000, he and his Michigan parachute team buddies started meeting up. Carl started to try to get him to talk about it. In the meantime, a couple years later, my uncle got really sick and nearly died, and Carl could tell on the phone he was ill. So Carl flew across the country, went to my uncle's house, found him collapsed on the floor, called 911, got him to the hospital. And then that's the first time I spoke to Carl. And he started sending me drafts of his book about my uncle, and he asked me to stay in contact and keep him up to date about his health.
And about what year is this?
This was early 2000s, but in around 2005, I think it was 2005, is the first time I start saving letters, because Carl sent me a letter saying the book has taken a new direction. And I think that was around the time that he started recording my uncle's confession and finally got my uncle to say, yes, I did this, right? It was maybe a couple years before that. But then, so Carl and I started talking about it, and he started sharing information with me. But in my visits to my uncle, he would not admit it. He wouldn't deny it, but he wouldn't admit it. He would give me different short responses when I'd ask him specific questions. And then the first time my uncle indicated to me he might possibly be Cooper was in 2011. He sent me a copy of an article with some comments on it. So.
And what did you think of that first, hey, by the way, I may or may not be D.B. Cooper? What was your reaction to that?
It was nice that he finally admitted it, because by then Carl had been talking to me and asking me for other information or sending me letters about the story for 6 years. So I felt like my uncle finally trusted me. And there's a side note that's kind of unrelated. There was a point in around 2011, 2012, my mom and I were visiting, and I was in his kitchen, and he had a bunch of friends over. And one of his friends I had never met in person before, but had heard about. And this person was talking about some illegal activities, unrelated, just something he had done years before. And he turned and he saw me, and he gave me a look like, I'm going to kill you because if you talk, type of thing. And my uncle just looked at him and like gave him a nod of his head, like, it's okay. And so then they continued the story. They didn't wait till I left the room. And I felt like at that point I had earned some trust.
What was your thoughts of Walt growing up? Did you know he was this mischievous character, that he was outlandish? What was your impression of him growing up?
So I looked back to my teenage diaries to see when I referenced him. And there's one where I say, my uncle's really interesting. He's a really bad speller, but we've been writing to each other, and I can't wait to meet him because I don't remember him from when I was a little kid. Much of my very young time, years, I was either too young to remember him or he was overseas in the Middle East. So when he started writing, he would tell me about his exploits in the Middle East. And I just thought he was very adventurous and very interesting. He spoke several languages, Russian, Polish, Indonesian. Wherever he would go and work, he would learn the language. So I also thought he was very wealthy because he had started making a lot of money and he had done some investments and things like that. So I just thought he was an interesting guy. And then as I got older and learned more and more about the work that he did overseas, I just thought that he was a fascinating person. I honestly didn't know that he was a mercenary to really near the end of his life.
He obviously cared a lot about you. You were generous enough to send me some letters that he wrote. And even his sign off and everything is so sweet. Oh, Lisa, I love you. Your Uncle Walt. I have a few nieces. I've never written him a letter.
With his own children, he had been absent and he was not a good father. If you talk to his children who are close to my age, a little bit younger, a little bit older, they will have a whole different story about him because he was absent, or when he was around, he was in his angry, violent stage, right? But I'm a niece. I have different expectations from him. I would see him once a year when I was adult, and then keep in contact via letters or on telephone calls. I have different expectations. He was really proud of me and my parenting with my daughters. I was a single parent. We didn't agree on politics, and we have some hilarious letters where we jab back and forth at each other over politics, and we drew each other pictures and crazy things like that. But yeah, he was very considerate. And you should see the letters he wrote my daughter, Sydney. When she was in middle school, she was having troubles with her friends. And they go back and forth in a series of about 12 letters where, he just makes fun of her and she makes fun of him. And he sent her a glass slipper and told her she's a princess and that type of thing. And then if I didn't write back, he would send a letter to my dog. And he would tell her, he called her Paws of Fury, and he'd tell her it must be horrible living with those people. And, he'd make fun of my mom and I and our politics and stuff like that. So he had a good sense of humor.
Yeah, one of the letters you sent me, it was like, oh yeah, I was waiting in line next to these two young guys in blue jeans with holes in them and long hair. They must have been Democrats.
Yes. So he had been a union guy and a lifelong Democrat, but later in life, he became a Republican. He actually ran for public office in the small town he was in as a Democrat, even after he had kind of changed. So yeah, he would make fun of me and my mom being Democrats and call us, crazy liberals. And I would tease him back for his politics. So
I hadn't heard he ran for office. What position?
it was like town supervisor. They live in a town. He lived near the end of his life in a little town called Escoda. It has less than 1,000 people in it. And their entire town board was like kicked out of office and replaced. So he ran for office, but he did not get elected. And he ran as a Democrat, which I don't understand because by that time he was not any longer.
So back to Carl Lauren and when this all gets started. So yeah. Carl is the first to sort of mention to you, I think he's Cooper.
Yes.
And what was your thought when Carl said that to you?
I talked to my mom about it because my mom knows Walt really well. They're brother and sister, right? They grew up on the streets of Detroit. Their dad died when they were really young, and their mom had to work even out of town and left them home alone for days on end. And they lived in what's called the Cass Corridor. My mom said there was a park there that you had to run through as fast as you can so you didn't get shanked, And she remembers sitting on, looking out her window or running up to her apartment through the back stairs, trying not to, to avoid the junkies and the knife fights. And you're talking 1930s, 1940s, right? So I asked my mom and she said, yeah, absolutely, it could be. But neither of us were truly convinced. It took a while to put the story together. And then recently, Mom and I have been going through the like Tina Mucklow's interview and Florence Schaffner's interviews, the two flight attendants who spent the most time with DB Cooper. And there are certain phrases that they repeat that sound very much like my uncle. In fact, my mom was saying, "Oh yeah, that's Walt." The something along the line of Florence Schaffner says something like, "I don't believe that, are you serious?" Or "I don't believe you're hijacking this plane." And he's like, "I don't believe it either, but I am." Something along that line. So my mom's like, "Yeah, that's Walt." So I think we just saw a lot of similarities in his character. I think for me, the first time that I really thought it could possibly be him was when I found out that DB Cooper handed Tina Mucklow some money. That when she saw him counting the money, she was trying to keep things light. And so she said, and this is in the FBI interview, right? She said, "Well, that's a lot of money. Would you mind sharing it?" And she was kind of joking. And he, without skipping a beat, picked up a packet of money and said, "Sure, here." And then she was like, "Oh, wait, no, we can't accept gratuities." And he said, "Okay." Well, just his nonchalance with that, but also because Walt had robbed a Bob's Big Boy in 1965. And he had flirted with the female manager and handed her some money as soon as she handed it, gave him the money. He immediately handed her some money and said, "This is for being nice to me. Don't worry, the insurance company will pay for it." He said she stuck it in her brassiere. And then he felt bad for the few patrons that were still there. So he handed them $100. He walked out of the restaurant and the police were giving him a ticket because he happened to be parked the wrong way on a one-way street. And he walked right into the police. He had taken in a plastic briefcase and a Tommy gun, and he threw them against the fence, hoping they wouldn't see it. But he matched the description, so they arrested him on the spot. And actually, that's what he told me when we talked, when he finally gave me the full confession in 2013, the written confession, and we talked about it. I said, "So everything in here is true?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "What Carl's been telling me is true?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Wow, you're really infamous." And he said, "You got away with an amazing crime." And he said, he got very angry. And he said, "I didn't get away with anything." And when I asked him why, that's when he said, "Better off dead than poor." And he said it led him down. The Bob's Big Boy robbery was kind of the start of what led him down this path where he had difficulty getting work that led to one mishap after another. And that's what led to the hijacking, because he was so destitute at that point. He was just like, "I just as well use my skills." And, there were 250 hijackings in the US alone up to that point. I don't think people realize that in like a 5-year span. We only hear about this particular hijacking, I think. So he had heard about other hijackings and just figured he would just jump out of the plane and not let it land and then have the FBI arrest him when it landed.
We were going back and forth a little bit before during doing the show. And in one of your emails to me, you said, "Hey, this Bob's Big Boy story, I think it's important to the character of, not only Walt, but DB Cooper. And many disagree with me." And I think that is really important because it says not only the type of guy who he was, but there's a history of this exact behavior.
Correct.
How many bank robbers on their way out give out stacks of cash?
Right.
He risked his life for this 200,000, and each packet is at least $2,000. So to give away 1% of his ransom, I think that's a big deal. He didn't just pull 320s out of a packet.
Right.
Give. It says he tried to give her a handful of cash.
And talking about the character aspects, and people obviously have to trust me or read, although they could listen to, some of the recordings. But one of the other things is I have writings, and I can send those to you to show you, where he talks about being polite. He always told me, "You should always try being polite first." And this is from a man who sprayed a woman's car with bullets after she wouldn't move her car. He asked polite several times and she wouldn't do it. So then he took action, but he always tried to be polite first. And he was often very deferential to women. He was a very different person with men than he was with women. And all the flight attendants, all three, said that he was very polite. He was very deferential to them. Florence Schaffner said he tried to tip all three of the women. And I think that was related to, you guys have been very nice here. She had given him change for a 20 for the drink that he ordered, and he tried to use that to tip them. And then, of course, when Tina was making jokes, he handed her a pack of $2,000. Like you said, that's a lot of money to, you're risking your life. You don't know if the FBI is going to storm the plane at any moment, and you're handing back money. So I think that character trait, the politeness, and just also he certainly had all the skill sets, having been in special forces, search and rescue, all of that type of thing.
One of the things I think is really interesting about the whole Walt Reca thing is that you guys had all this information and then, per his request, sat on it and waited for him to die before any of this would come out.
Yes. So Carl was insistent. And in fact, when Walt gave me like this, I have like a movie playing in my head, because I don't know if I made a mistake or not. But in August 2013, my mom and I were trying to get Walt into like hospice care because he was very, very ill. He died about 6 months later. He didn't want to leave his dogs, Dr. Pepper and Mr. Squirt. So we were trying to find somebody to take his unruly dogs and get him to go into hospice. And I was packing up all of his files, which I now have, and his passports and his KGB ID and all of this. And we were talking about the confession, and he said, Carl wants me to sign it and have it notarized. I'll sign it. Can you take it into town and get it notarized? And I said, it doesn't work like that. You have to be there in front of the notary. So I start reading it, and the first page is all the aliases he's used, all his passports and social security numbers. And one of the aliases is Dan Cooper, DB Cooper. I had read a lot of articles about men in their 80s who had been caught years later for an armed robbery done 40, 50 years before and going to jail for it. And I was like, well, you can't sign this. If the person doing the notary reads it and calls the FBI, you'll go to jail. I was just so convinced that the FBI was going to arrest him, put him in jail. I was so convinced they were going to raid my house and take all the passports I have that prove all of these different places he was during the 1970s and 80s. I hid things, and now I laugh because I don't think they cared. But we sat on it because we really were afraid. We really do believe the story. We really do believe he is Cooper, and we did not want him to go to jail. And so I showed the testimony to my mom, his confession, and she told him, don't do it. Don't sign it, Walt. Just don't do it. Even Carl had tracked down an eyewitness whose story matched Walt's and everything. And we kept that secret for many years. I think
Osadic,
Jeff Osadic, yeah. And that's an interesting story in and of itself. Walt didn't remember where he landed. He just knew that it was he knew the freeways he took to get home. He knew he had landed off of one freeway that intersected with another and had a river by it. He limped about a quarter to half a mile into a cafe. And inside the cafe was a man with, he said, I won't use the word he used, but it was an expletive, something guitar. And he had a cowboy hat on. He said he was soaking wet because it was kind of sleeting out, and he had rolled up his parachute and put it in the parachute case that he had the money in, and he had dumped the money in his raincoat and wrapped the raincoat up and put it under his arm. So he walks in, he said he's beet red, and he sees the guy at the counter. He orders himself a cup of coffee, but he's shaking too hard, he can't drink it. And he says to the other guy at the cafe, hey, I need to call my buddy and tell him where I am. Could you give him directions? Because I'm not sure where I am. And the cowboy said, sure. So Walt went to the back of the restaurant and to the payphone, called his friend, Don Brennan, said, Don, I did the thing. And Don's like, what are you talking about? I thought you were kidding. We were drunk. I didn't think you were serious. And he goes, well, you need to come get me. I'm going to put somebody on the phone because I don't know where I am. So he called the cowboy over and and Cowboy gave directions. He left and Walt bought his cup of coffee. They shook hands and the guy told him, well, I'm playing in a band tonight, so I got to go. So he left. So Carl took out, he was a pilot, a professional pilot himself. He took out flight maps and started looking at the freeways that Walt said he took home and flight paths that way and what could possibly be the flight path. And then he flew to Seattle and drove that route and stopped in a bunch of cafes and said, hey, by chance, 40 years ago, was there a guy who drove a lumber dump truck? And oh, that was another detail. My uncle said there was a dump truck in the parking lot, and that the guy had been driving like a dump truck, but a lumber dump truck, not like a trash dump truck. Carl asked around and he met a waitress and she said, you know, that sounds like you're talking about the Tenaway Junction Cafe near Cle Elum. And she goes, but you know, the cafe burnt down and ironically, there's a fire station there now, but you might want to go into the town, right? And you might want to go into the town and ask around. So Carl went to the town, asked around, and he found the son of the owner of the cafe, a guy named Wayne Willett. And Wayne, I believe, owned a gas station, had lived in Cle Elum for a long time. And Carl said, hey, Vince, is there a guy from 40 years ago who drove a lumber dump truck and maybe sang in a cowboy band or a country band? And Wayne goes, yeah, that sounds like Jeff Osiadich. He's lived here his whole life and he plays in a country band. He used to work for a lumber company, drove a truck. So Carl left his card and said, can you have him, when you see him again, can you have him call me? And what's really interesting is I met Jeff, I think the second time I met him was when the documentary, The Real D.B. Cooper, was shown in Cle Elum to the whole townspeople. And I was sitting next to Jeff. I just, had lunch with him and, got to talk to him more about the story. And in the part of the interview where they interview Jeff, he talks about how this moment when Wayne says, hey, some guy from Florida was looking for you. Jeff says, I was thinking, what is it? I don't know anybody from Florida. Is it the IRS or maybe a jealous husband? The whole town erupts laughing because I guess in his younger days, Jeff was quite the ladies' man and had broken up a few marriages. So that's the gist that I got from people. So anyway, when he called Carl, Carl said, I'm going to ask you about 40 years ago, were you in the Tenaway Junction Cafe one night when a guy limped in and was soaking wet and asked you for directions? And Jeff said, well, let me think about that. And he said, well, yeah. He goes, and I remember that night because I felt really bad. I had driven by him on the road and I didn't stop to pick him up. And then he comes into the cafe. I was like, sorry, buddy, I didn't pick you up. And he said, don't worry about it, kid. And he said that, he had no passenger seat. Plus it was a company vehicle and it was against company policy to pick somebody up. So he said the guy, the guy was beet red and he had his coat under his arm. And I asked Jeff, why didn't you think that was weird? And he said, sure, I thought it was weird, but it was none of my business. And I was thinking that's so much like a guy not to, ask those kind of details sometimes. A girl would be like, what are you doing? That's just stupid. Put your coat on. But anyway, and his story was the same. He said he got on the phone. He gave the guy directions. He said, which way are you coming? Through Snoqualmie Pass or Blewett Pass? The guy said Blewett. And he said, 70. And you go, be snow in Stevens Pass and it'll take you about an hour and a half to 2 hours to get here. So that was the stories matched up, but without a whole lot of detail. And then he said the same thing. My uncle bought his cup of coffee. They shook hands and he went to his first professional gig. He said he got paid less than $5, but because he got paid, it made him a professional. But that was why it stuck out in his head. And I asked him, I said, well, when you heard about the hijacking and you saw the sketch, did you think that maybe you had met DB Cooper? And he said, no, because they said it was 150 miles away where he jumped. And that sketch didn't look like your uncle. It didn't look like anybody. It looked like an alien. That he said, nobody has a chin that thin. So he just was like, he didn't hear about it, I think, for like a week or so. And by then the sketch had been modified. The first sketch looks a lot more like my uncle, but then within a couple of days, they started thinning out the face and thinning out the face.
Have you ever met Jeff's son, Darren?
I met him at the briefly at the launch of the documentary because his band played. They're in a band, and Jeff and Darren wrote a song called "The Money and the Man" about Jeff's encounter with
I
D.B.
bring
Cooper.
that up
and it's
because
a really nice song.
Yeah, I bring that up because from now on, the show will be ending with that song. I got permission from Darren to use that in the show.
Great.
So, yeah, interesting that
is
it
so
happened to be your episode, the first one that will be the first episode that ends with The Money and the Man. It's a great song. I really like it.
It is, because even it just is so like haunting and sad in a way, isn't it? I don't know. I love it. I thought they did a really nice job.
There's a gentleman, Todd Snyder, I believe his name is, who also has a song about DB Cooper, but Darren's is way better.
Oh.
What year did Walter die?
He died on President's Day 2014.
2014.
Yeah, February 2014.
So let's go 90 days after Walt passes. Is Carl now like, we got to get this out?
He was ready. Yeah, I think everything was ready to go by then. And you can see it. I have a lot of letters from Carl. He became like an uncle to me himself. And a lot of letters from him encouraging me to write my story, because I have a different aspect of my uncle's story that hasn't been covered yet. And the letters, like you said, the letters are really hilarious. And his letters to my dog, and to my kids. But I think he was pretty much ready to go. I don't think it came out until 2016, 2017, though.
I would say late 2017.
Yeah, I think it was May 2017 was when it came out.
Because I remember when it came out and there was a press conference. And I believe it was Vern at the press conference. Does anyone have any questions? And no one had any questions. And I was like, how can no one have no questions? This is crazy. I wish I was there.
It's really funny, and maybe you're an expert. You are such an expert on all of this. And I will say one thing I am not an expert on is all the other suspects. And I've heard you on this podcast talk about how you wanted to do this to explore all the suspects, not just one particular angle. And I think that's what makes the podcast so interesting. And you do such a great job, not only in the interviews, but also keeping an open mind, which I think is also very helpful.
Well, you brought up at the beginning of this that all these DB Cooper suspects have the most interesting lives.
Right.
Whether or not Barb Dayton is Dan Cooper, I like that story. That is a great story. Barb led an amazing life. The same thing could be said for E. Howard Hunt or Kenny Christensen, even, who is probably one of the most boring, personally, suspects in the Vortex. I mean, that story is crazy. And then you have like the Ted Braden, and you have Walter Reca and Pika, where it's like he became a secret agent, and there was like a mind control session thing he had. It was in Boise, Idaho too, right? Did he say
right? So here's where the story gets conspiracy theorist, and so I will refer to facts and let you know when I am veering off. But at the time of the hijacking, Walt was working for Vanell Corporation. At the time, Vanell had multiple CIA contracts in Vietnam. Walt was working on the Grand Coulee Dam as an iron worker, but he had gotten the job through a man he called Phil Q. I have his full name and address and multiple addresses around the world, but Walt said he met Phil in Elsinore, California a few years before when he tried to join the CIA, and he was turned down. He was turned down and got the letter of rejection about 2 months after he had been arrested for a severe assault and battery. And that might have been the time that somebody told him that airborne wasn't shit. So he beat the shit out of the guy. You might have to bleep that. I apologize. But anyway, he was turned down a couple months after the assault and battery, but I have the Army intelligence letter where it was requested of Army intelligence to test him for a language proficiency, and he came back proficient in Poland and Russia. So you're talking the height of the Cold War. And Phil Q got him the job at Vanell, I think, to start getting him into Vanell as a possible mercenary. And there are several articles around this time about how Vanel was hiring veterans and special forces veterans to work in Saudi Arabia. And of course, for the next 2 years, Walt all of a sudden went from being destitute poor to doing a cash down payment on a house. And in the documentary, they interview the guy he paid the down payment to. And he remembers that Walt drove up in a brand new car. And he starts going to Boise, Idaho on a regular basis for training. And he said the most that he would say about the training, and he didn't tell me any of this, he told this to Carl, was that they would ask him really weird questions, and Carl would say, well, would you answer? He goes, I'd answer like my life depended on it and I wanted to stay alive. But what he said after the hijacking is he went to work on Monday, but he was limping. And so he got called in by his management and sent to the infirmary where they said he had a broken leg. I don't know if Vanel keeps records like this years, it's 50 years now. And if there would be any way to track this down, right? But that would be evidence that would show he had a broken leg right after the hijacking. But anyway, within a couple weeks, when he was back on the job, or a couple months actually, he was approached by somebody on the job, and they invited him out for a beer. My uncle never turned down a beer, so especially a free one. So they went out, he with these two guys from the job, and they just said vaguely, we know what you did. Do you want to go to jail? And he's like, no. Now, in reality, he wasn't sure if they were talking about the fact it was a hijacking or the fact he had skipped out on his parole for something else in Michigan, but he assumed it was the hijacking, and he just said, no, I don't want to go to jail. So they're like, you work for us. So that sounds very weird, but I think when you watch like American Made with Tom Cruise about the Barry Seal story, he was approached the same way. So I think that there's some ties, not that movie is probably as factual as Barry Seal's actual book or his tapes, but that's how he said he was approached, and that's how my uncle said he was approached. And so after that, he started training for a couple years, and then within 2 years, he has passports with stamps from all over the world, and he starts working in Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Algeria, Scotland, other countries. He got his passport through the U.S. State Department 2 years before he legally changed his name. He was using Reca illegally, but he still got a passport through the State Department. So I think certain, things were taken care of or something behind the scenes. I can't imagine they wouldn't have known his birth certificate was faked. There would have been no history of him as Reca besides, in Washington. So I don't know. That's just one of the interesting tidbits, but that's how he said. And then the Boise, Idaho stuff, Carl thought that was part of the MK Ultra program. I don't know. Walt never talked to me about that. And that was the whole, mind control or using drugs to try to control people or hypnotism and that type of thing. I don't know. You might know more about that than I do. I don't know a lot about that program.
And when Walt goes back to work Monday after the hijacking, he reports that he broke his leg at work.
I can't remember. He never told me. I don't know I'd have to look at what he told Carl where he said he broke it. I think he might have just said a mishap. They knew he was a parachutist. I mean, he parachuted, he learned in the Army, but he continued for, weekends and for fun and for excitement. He parachuted all the time. So they had to know that. He might have told him he broke it parachuting over the weekend. I don't know. I really don't know what he told them.
I thought the story was that he went to work and said he broke it at work so he would get the time off work and workman's comp would pay for the leg. And then he would have that story that the leg was broken at work.
Yeah.
But I don't want to tell you your story.
No, I will just tell you that could be what he told Carl. I don't know that. I don't know that part of the story of what exactly he said. And he and I didn't discuss it. I really regret when he gave me the testimony and that there were so many questions I have what I focused in on was, why did you do this? And do you have regrets? And he was really, at the end of his life, he was afraid he was going to hell. And it wasn't the hijacking, it was what he did after. He told me some of the things he did after, only a couple things. And those couple things were enough to send you to hell. So I would say, I focused on that and those conversations and didn't get into the details of, I wish now I knew more about the hijack. I didn't know a lot about the hijacking, right? I didn't know much about it at that point, except what I saw on Wikipedia. So I wish I had known to ask him some of these detailed questions. I would have gotten so much more out of him. I could have answered some more questions.
Well, I want to know the answer to the questions you did ask. Why did he do it? And did he have regrets?
Yeah, he did. So he said at that point, what we would call it today is suicide by cop, right? He was contemplating whether or not to fall off the dam so his family could get insurance money, or just do this harebrained idea. He was fearless. He was a criminal. I mean, he had several criminal charges. He had done the armed robbery. He had been arrested when he was a juvenile. So he thought, what the heck? People are robbing planes, and he called it robbing a plane. Robbing a bank and asking for a plane, just go rob the plane. He had talked to his different friends over the years about how they would do it. So what he told me was, he thought at that point he was better off dead than poor. And he just, I'm going to do it. If I get out the back of the plane, I will survive. He knew once he exited the plane, he would live. Between his parachute experience, his search and rescue experience, he had lived in the jungle. I mean, he had talked to us about the times he had lived in the jungle in Sierra Leone, without anything, just in a shack or just out by the side of the road. So, I mean, he felt very comfortable with his survival skills. I think he thought that the FBI might charge the plane and shoot him. That was, I think, his biggest fear, right? But at that point, he didn't even care. He'd either succeed or he'd die trying. Afterwards, like I said, I told him, well, you got away with this incredible crime. You're famous. And I'm kind of thinking, wow, I have a great story to tell. My uncle's D.B. Cooper. Not really thinking about it from the victim standpoint, which is a whole nother side of the story that is starting to come out, which I'm glad. But I'm thinking, wow, this is cool. I can tell my friends and family. But he got very furious. I mean, he had a temper, and he was just, I didn't get away with anything. And what happened after, he said, just led me down this path where I couldn't get out for many years. And he just said, and I don't know what's going to happen to me after I die. And he was very worried. Now, I felt a lot better after talking to Loretta, Carl's wife. I saw Loretta just a couple months ago. Carl passed away in October 2020. I talked to him on the phone about a week before he died, and he was like, Lisa Story, don't you for a minute doubt that your uncle is not D.B. Cooper. He is. I know it. I knew it the night it happened. Loretta knew it. Art called me, Art Lucero. Willard called me. Willard's father called me and said, what did he do? We knew it. We knew it immediately. And I have the evidence and all of that. But, and then I visited him a week before he died. But at that point, he wasn't talking as much. Anyway, I visited Loretta a couple months ago. And I get sidetracked sometimes. She said that Walt had called her at some point and said, hey, why didn't you tell me about your religion? She is a Jehovah's Witness. And the last year or two of my uncle's life, he was, his health wasn't good. He got really overweight. My mom used to say, Walt, at least walk to the mailbox, get some type of exercise, right? But every Wednesday, the Jehovah's Witnesses would knock on his door and he'd let them in. He was lonely. He'd let them in and they would read the Bible together. And they told him there's no such thing as hell, that was created. That concept of hell was created. I think it was Dante and Dante's Inferno or whatever. And that made him feel a lot better. And so he talked to Loretta several times about hell and the fact that there is no hell. And that was a relief to him near the end, because he really felt like he couldn't make up for the actions he took in his life.
It's interesting. My grandfather, when he was on his deathbed, was convinced he was going to go to hell. And I was 17, maybe 18 at the time. And it was really hard on my mom because it was her father. And just that belief that you're going to go to hell on your deathbed.
Did he have reasons for it, or he just didn't think he was a good enough person in his life? Or
he didn't think he was a good enough person. I believe most of it probably had to do with like womanizing and cheating. And that was, sorry to throw shade on my grandfather, but that was his vice was women.
Yeah. Hey, it happens to the best of them.
So Walt passes away in 2014, but you guys don't come forward until 2017. So tell me what happens in between there.
So I start writing my story and going through his papers. I had packed up his papers, but didn't really read them. And even now I'll read something and go, oh my gosh, I missed this before, right? Carl continued. The person, Vern Jones from Principia Media, who published his book and was working on the publication of the book, also started doing a documentary. So I think in 2016, they interviewed me for that documentary and they put that together. And I think I was working on the story and just, I work full time. I have a family, I have commitments. So just doing it here and there and on the weekends. But Carl was just also he ran a ranch in Florida and working on his story. And I think just trying to tie up the loose ends. I just started going through all his papers and reading everything. I have, more information than I even know what it means sometimes. I'll find things online or that I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what that was. Or I will tell you something. This is really interesting, I think. Walt and Carl had said that when he worked overseas, the way he got his assignments was through foreign media correspondence. And in fact, there's an article that he kept, and it's one of the few assassination attempts he told my mom and I he did. And he said he couldn't tell me other things because that would get us both killed. And I'm like, well, you can tell me this one though? Like this could get us killed. But on it, he wrote that, and the headline said, this person was killed. My uncle added en route to Moscow, and he crossed out it said foreign correspondent over the author's name, and he wrote CIA, and then he crossed that out. So he had a letter, like 1 or 2 letters in his files that were one of them was from the Detroit Free Press by, gosh, I'm going to forget the guy's name. It was either Adamson or Cruden. And it's the first couple paragraphs he said were just baloney. And it was basically, thank you for the photos. We can't use them in our Polish calendar. Well, I don't know why the Detroit Free Press would do a Polish calendar. But anyway, they said, if you're in Vienna, though, please stop by our office. We'd love to see you. So he said that was the way he got his directions. And I just figured that would be nothing that I could ever prove, or it was just an interesting tidbit, but I wasn't sure how much I even believed it. And not too long ago, I found online congressional testimony, official congressional documents where the CIA director says, yes, we use these foreign correspondents to pass on information or as actual spies. And then there are people like Dan Rather testifying in Congress saying this has got to stop, because when we have reporters or editors in these like war-torn countries, they get arrested and being accused of being a CIA spy because they assume all US foreign correspondents are spies. And I also found I think it was Khrushchev was complaining because this one reporter, and I think it might have been the reporter who was on the article that my uncle gave me, kept having information that nobody else knew but their secret, part of their KGB knew. Well, it's because he was connected to the CIA. So I just find that it still it's still not hard evidence, but it still shows that my uncle had these pieces of documents and that also tie to this bigger picture. And now I can tie it to congressional testimony. So I just find that really interesting. And I'm still discovering things. Anyway, the book came out. Carl's book came out. Then Joe Koenig came out with a book where he took the tape recordings. When Carl was talking to my uncle over the years in 2000 to 2010, he started at some point recording them. And I know when people read the transcript or listen to the recordings, they talk about how they feel that Carl was leading the witness a little bit, pulling, almost like feeding him information. But there are two reasons for that. One, my uncle never exaggerated. It was very difficult to get him to give you details. He gave you like yes and no answers, even though you didn't ask him a yes or no question. And the more interesting the story, the more he kept the details very low key. And at this point, Carl had already spoken and gotten the confession out of him. I think what he was trying to do is get it on tape, right? That's what he was trying to do. So you have a little bit of that in some portions, and then you get a little bit, and there are times Carl's trying to get him to say something and he's just like, no, that's not true. I didn't plan it. I figured it out in the bar and wrote it down in the back of a bar napkin, right? And Carl many times is trying to talk about how much planning he put into it. And he's like, there might've been some planning, but it wasn't what, he's just like stop trying to make me out to sound like this great, brilliant mastermind. I wasn't, or else I would have had some other details taken care of. So I think that's something. So Joe Koenig's book comes out, and Joe is a former Michigan State police officer who was the lead investigator on the Jimmy Hoffa investigation. Mm-hmm. He's a forensic linguist. Thank you. And so he went through the recordings and the transcript looking for people do and say certain things when they lie, right? And so he was looking for anywhere where there wasn't truth being told. And he determined that Waltz was not lying, that everything he said, he at least believed to be true and was factual. He also interviewed Jeff Osiadich in person and looked at his tape recorded interview, and also looked at a written confession or story, what happened. And he also determined Jeff to be telling the truth. I found out after the fact that he also looked at my interview that they did for the documentary and said I was truthful. And I was like, I didn't know you were going to show it to him. I was like, well, thank goodness he found me to be truthful.
Right. Everyone's telling the truth except for Lisa.
Right. Well, it's probably good because I probably would have been really nervous and not come across so well. And then it would have looked like I was lying.
All right. So the announcement finally comes out. Mm-hmm. Take me back to that day, the day before. What were you thinking was going to happen? Were you nervous? Were you excited?
I thought because we had so many character traits that were tied, and an eyewitness, and a flight path. And I know you might want to get into that later because it doesn't align with what the FBI said, but especially the eyewitness and the written testimony, the recorded testimony. I don't think any other witness is on tape that I know of. Now, I'm not an expert, you are, but I don't think any other suspect is on tape. Any other eyewitness is on tape. I don't think his written testimony is 11 pages or 12 pages, single space typed. I thought my home was going to be raided by the FBI looking for papers. I thought this was going to blow up. The day it happened, or the day after, Carl was on Fox News, and he tended to go off on different side tracks. So they had told him to kind of keep it brief, but he was too brief. And so his interview did not go really well. He was like, well, the guy asked him something like, so you think your best friend was DB Cooper? And he's like, well, yeah, or something along that line. And then the guy's like, okay, like, tell me more. And Carl's just sitting there like, well, of course, didn't you read my, I mean, he just didn't expand on it. So the poor reporter, I think they were going to do a 10-minute interview and they cut it off after like a minute or two. And Carl was just trying to be brief like he was told, because he often went off on side stories and all of that. And so they cut it off. And then that afternoon, there was a school shooting with quite a few children killed. And that just became the headline. And it took over the news cycle, and this went nowhere. In my opinion, it just disappeared. I think it got a little bit of attention, and I think people in the media and other people took it a little as him as a credible suspect. It didn't go anywhere. But I will tell you something very interesting, in my opinion. In 2016, right before the book and the documentary came out, I saw somebody interviewed that used to be our next door neighbor. And I reached out. She had moved back to Las Vegas. She's one of the first female FBI agents on the West Coast. And she had been our neighbor when we first moved to Las Vegas. So I reached out to her and said, hey, can we do dinner? So my mom and I went and had dinner with her, and I brought my uncle's confession. And we were talking, and then I told her about Walt, and he had passed away a couple of years before. And I said, hey, I had this confession, and we told her the whole story. And I brought with me the KGB ID, his different passports, his jump book, some different documentation that would show we're being sincere. And she knew us. She knew we weren't lunatics, right? This was not the type of thing we talk about. You don't catch my mom and I talking about this kind of thing or conspiracy theories or that very often or at all. So she knew we were normal, average people. Well, she was retired FBI, but she said, email me a draft of this. So I emailed it to her, and she sent it to, she said, the Portland FBI office. And she said, these friends of mine, they're normal people. They're not crazy. I swear to you. But they had this confession from a family member that says these DB Cooper, and this is a lengthy, detailed confession, and you might be interested in it. She got a reply back that she said she thought was very, very odd. The person sent it back and said, I'm not going to look at it because we're deciding to close the case, but thank you very much. And she said the reason it's odd is that out of professional courtesy, when a fellow agent says, I think you should look at this, you do it just out of professional courtesy. She had never in her life been told by another FBI agent, sorry, I'm not even going to look at that. So she thought that was really odd. She didn't say that proved anything. She didn't say she believed the story or anything along that line, but she just said, I just think that's just really weird. And then soon after that, they closed the case, right? That's when they shut down the case in 2016. I don't know the month. I can tell you that I know that our discussion with her happened well before the elections, because we had talked about the elections with her. And I remember that conversation we had, which is unrelated to this. So I know it happened before the elections in 2016. Exactly when, I don't remember.
July of 2016, as far as I'm aware, is when the FBI announced they were closing the investigation.
Okay. And I don't know when we had dinner with her and when she sent the paperwork to them. And I don't know if it was right after they shut down the case or right before they shut down the case.
And there's also an odd story with Carl and Walt about Carl sort of stealing some of Walt's DNA.
Yeah.
And getting that submitted.
So Carl really wanted to prove this, like hard evidence. And I think we had that discussion on the suspects panel at CooperCon. What is it going to take? And I even think if you come up with DNA evidence, there'll still be people who aren't convinced, right? Because what do they have to compare it with? They destroyed the cigarettes. They lost the hair. They don't know if the tie was actually Cooper's or somebody else's because they found it wedged between the seats, that type of thing, right? So anyway, Carl was hoping they did have DNA evidence. The hijacking happened in 1971, years before they knew how to do DNA evidence. So he had hired an attorney and told him the story, but he didn't tell him Walt's name or where Walt lived. Meanwhile, Carl had seen Walt at a get-together, and while Walt had left the room, he took a tissue that Walt had blown his nose in, which is disgusting, and put it in a baggie, tucked it in his shirt. He gave that to the attorney. The attorney sent the information and the story kind of about how Carl tracked down the eyewitness, who the eyewitness was, I think, or just that Don Brennan had picked him up, but didn't give any names, including the name of Don Brennan. So kind of general details about the case. And the attorney sent it up to, I think it was Larry Carr, Agent Larry Carr, I don't know for a fact. And nothing happened for a while. There was some going back and forth. And then eventually Larry Carr came back and said, there's no DNA match, but what was the name of the person who picked him up? And which they thought was weird. If there was no DNA match, then why would you care who picked him up, right? But in the meantime, after it was sent off, Walt called up Carl, and Carl had not told him he had done this. And he was furious. And he said, why did you DNA me? I can't believe you did that. I trusted you. We're done. We are not talking again. That's it. It's over. And he hung up, and he wouldn't speak to Carl for some time. And then after that, he wouldn't allow Carl to record him. So Carl's suspicion, and this is, his suspicion in theory, is that somebody at the FBI alerted Walt that his DNA had been submitted.
I love that story. That is so crazy.
It is very crazy. And, I'll tell you something else, Darren. This is so funny because little things pop into my head that I think nothing of. There was a time when I was a newlywed. I don't know if I had my first child or not. I might have been just recently married, and I had moved back in with my mom, I think. And we were saving up for our first house. And Walt came into town, and it was very weird. He came into town, and he came to visit us for 2 hours, and then he immediately turned around and drove home. And he said and this is vague, so he had driven a friend into town, and the friend was picking up a car to drive it back to Michigan. And I said, well, why didn't you guys fly in, or why didn't you fly in? There was some reason. I asked him, you should have flown in. And he said, I can't get on an airplane. I'm on a no-fly list. I'm not allowed on airplanes, or something like this. And this was between 1985 and 1989 that this happened. And I had never heard of such a thing. And I don't know if he called it a no-fly list or I'm not allowed, but he said, I'm not allowed on airplanes. And I said, why not? He was, I have a criminal past. I can't get on an airplane. My name's on a list, is something like he said. The other thing he said, which is hilarious, was, I'm not staying, because we said, well, you're here, stay overnight. We have an extra bedroom. And he said, no, I got to leave. I was kicked out of Las Vegas and told never to return by the sheriff, so I have to leave. And I said, when did that happen? He said, in 1960, 61, whatever. I said, well, that sheriff's dead. I can tell you, I know that sheriff, and I know he's dead because he himself was quite infamous himself. And I said, no one will know. You can stay overnight. And he was still pissed 25 years later that the sheriff had kicked him out of Las Vegas and said, don't ever return. And that was because, and those are big headlines, right? In the local papers. He and his friends, Art Lucier and another friend, had come to town and pitched the idea of a parachute show, a jump show. And the Hacienda general manager, Dick Taylor, said, well, okay, we'll give it a try. So they had a few jumps and people really loved it. The problem was that in order to watch the show, people had to stop gambling and leave the casino to watch it. And that is not good for casino business. There is a reason there are no windows or clocks in a casino. It's so that you don't know what time it is and you don't leave those tables until every penny you have is gone. So there was a point where Dick Taylor called Walt and his friends in and said, guys, you guys are great. Everybody loves your show, but we're losing money because people are stopping gambling. You got one more jump. So Walt and his buddies planned a story a couple days before the jump that they're going to test out some new kind of flight suit, like those bat suits. And so the day of their final jump, the media's there, everybody's out to watch them. 2 bodies leave the plane and one pulls a chute. The other one doesn't pull a chute. And the body keeps coming and coming and coming closer and closer and closer. And people are screaming and the body hits the ground. The women are passing out, men are puking. My uncle's in the crowd laughing because they think it's my uncle, but it was a dummy. And so they had done this that they thought would just be hilarious. Well, they all got arrested and put in jail. And then when they made bail, they were escorted out of town by the sheriff. And he said, don't ever come back. I think they were put on an airplane with one-way tickets back to Michigan and told, don't ever come back to this town. So he, like 25 years later, was still angry and wouldn't come back to Vegas.
I think that's actually pretty funny. I mean, for a few minutes, it's not funny. But once you find out, oh, yeah, it was just a joke. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, I'm messed up enough that I could laugh at that point.
Laughed at, yeah. But that was the kind of stuff they did for years.
So you guys come forward with all of this. And then, like you said, it just kind of faded away real quick after that. Was that disappointing?
Yeah, it was. And I just recently, we did do an Expedition Unknown, the Discovery Channel episode with Josh Gates. And I was able to get some of the information out. And we were looking, there was a scene where we're all out there with, there were like 12 volunteers with metal detectors. And I just knew we weren't in the right location. So I was really disappointed. But the right location to look was private property, and they couldn't really get, I guess, permission or something to raid these people's property. But one of the people asked me, what do you want to get out of this? Why do you care? Because I really wanted to find solid evidence. I wanted to find the parachute. And they're like, why? And I couldn't answer the question. And I think I was just disappointed. I really do think it's him. And there are so many things that tie him to this story and to this crime. And I still can't really answer that question because I don't think it's going to make anybody in my family wealthy. It's not. And so I don't know. I guess I would like that peace of mind because I am kind of a fact-based person. It's nice to have the romantic vision of things, but it would be nice to know for a fact. So that's it. It was disappointing, though, that it just faded away because I do think out of almost all the suspects that I'm aware of, again, you're the expert, I'm not as much. It does seem like there is far more information tying him to the crime than not tying him to the crime, if that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. Like you said, this is the only case or suspect I'm aware of where you have a corroborating witness. And then you also you can listen to Walt's confession. It's not like you have to take the word for it of someone who had passed away, who was in the room, who heard the confession. The documentary is called D.B. Cooper, The Real Story. And you can hear Walt's own voice confess to the crime in that. Mm-hmm. I think that's so valuable.
I think so too. And you can tell by the way he talks about things that he's not a braggart, right? I think when you hear him, he's just not somebody who brags. There was a time where he jumped out of an airplane and broke his foot really bad, where the bones were sticking out. And he told his buddies, and one of the guys he was jumping with is Ken Sisler, who is, look him up on Wikipedia because he's a war hero. And they were doing some night jumps in the winter in Michigan in January. It was very cold. And he told his friends, hey, I broke my foot. You need to take me to the hospital. And they said, we're going up for one more jump. We'll take you when we get back. And he said, well, then I'm going too. And they said, well, who are you going to jump on? You're going to break the other foot. And he said, no, or you're going to hurt your broken foot. He said, no, I'll land on the good one. Well, it was really windy. He pulled his chute too late. He got dragged. He broke the other leg. And I asked him, well, at what point, Walt, did you think that jumping out of an airplane with a broken leg was a bad idea. And I thought he'd say when I broke the other one, or when my wife, yelled at me because I lost my job, or that kind of, because I couldn't stand on 2 feet because he was a barber at the time. But he said, when I was sitting on the toilet and I realized I couldn't wipe my own ass. And then that was it. Like, that's the only thing he said related to it,
I might be wrong, but with this second broken leg, didn't Walt say, well, let's go grab a beer on the way to the hospital? And they stopped at the bar on the way to the hospital to get a beer?
I'm sure. Yeah. Well, it helped fight the pain, right?
I don't know. I think I need something a little bit more than a beer at that point.
Well, Carl said this about my uncle, and he knew my uncle. I knew my uncle later in life, when he was in his 50s and older. Carl knew him in his young, brash years and also later in life. But he said that my uncle could take pain like nobody else he ever saw. That he had never met anybody who could handle pain, who had a pain threshold at the level that Walt did. But it makes sense. Maybe it was because he was always drunk. Who knows? Maybe. He was always 2 sheets to the wind, or whatever that expression is. So,
all right. Here's a tough question for you.
Yep.
What is the best evidence for Walt Reca being Dan Cooper?
For me, it's the fact that he handed out money at the Bob's Big Boy robbery, and he also handed money to Tina Mucklow, because I think that is never done. I think the eyewitness, Jeff Osiadich is a former police officer. He's lived in that area his entire life. That entire town came out and saw that documentary. And not one person afterwards came up to me and said, don't believe Jeff, he's lying, or I wouldn't trust Jeff. Not one person. They came up, they asked for my autograph on Carl's book. They were very respectful. They believed the story. They believed Jeff. And I think you have to believe an entire town, right? I'm surprised they haven't put up, like, for trying to get people to come there for tourism, home, where DB Cooper landed or something. But they're just interesting people. Like, they're salt of the earth people. Many of them have lived there their whole life. It's a logging community, a mining community. They're just strong-willed people, and they believe Jeff. And so I don't see why other people can't believe Jeff. And I do know that probably should lead to the discussion of the flight path, right?
Right. I was going to say, I don't really have to ask you what the worst evidence is, because everyone else brings it up for you, right?
Right. So here's what I would say. I thought when I listened to Cliff Ammerman at CooperCon, I would be like, oh, I don't know how to get past this. But he reinforced the story for me. And he was an air traffic controller on duty that night. He said he talked to the pilots only twice and he said, in order to know what the transcript of that flight direction and the direction they were given, it would have to get the transcript from Northwest Airlines, because Northwest Airlines directed the plane's path out of Sacramento. And that is never done. If the plane leaves Seattle, it's usually out of Seattle. The other thing that I would say is that people like James Baker, former Department of Defense Secretary or Secretary of State, I'm not sure which one he was, Vanell had on their board of directors these type of people. I have a book called, Ropes of Sand by Wilbur Eveland. He's one of the first FBI agents, and he was a vice president of Vanell. And he talks, his book is about America's failure in the Middle East. And he talks about Vanell and their role with the CIA and the contractors. There have been, I don't know if this is credible. Somebody said at CooperCon that there had been a transcript and they had a copy of it, but they lost it when their computer crashed, that identified the hijacker as having a police record. So they knew while he was in the air who the hijacker was. To me, I think, and the other thing Ammerman said was that the published FBI flight path came out of McCord, most likely based on the Air Force jet radar on their planes or something along that line, if I remember correctly. So that is what the Air Force put out based on what the jets flew. The jets and the pilots are in the FBI reports saying that they lost the plane because they go much faster, right? And so they lost in their interview or the FBI's report about the jets. At some point, they lost the 727 flight 305 because they were going a lot faster. And they said the plane made a sharp turn, but it was a turn that it was like a sharp right or something, or a sharp, I don't know. They said that, and I have to find that paperwork. It's in the thousands of pages I've already read and didn't mark, which is crazy. I should do that. But anyway, I think the flight path is still up in the air. The other thing I will say is I talked to Catherine Scott, the captain's daughter, and her fiance at CooperCon. And it was the first night I sat down, and she wasn't at the table, and I introduced myself, and he introduced himself. He said he is her fiance and he's a pilot. And I told him, he asked why I was there. Was I a fan? And I said, well, actually, my uncle's one of the suspects. And I told him briefly the story, and he said, wow, that's really interesting. And then I said, but the only thing that doesn't line up is the flight path. And he said, well, honestly, they did that manually back then. And Catherine's dad did say that, it's not exact science. And I said, yeah, but 150 miles off? And he just shrugged. Now, I took the shrug as meaning maybe it could be, maybe not, but that's what I want to believe the shrug was. Maybe the shrug was like, yeah, I don't know what to tell you. 150 miles is way too much, right? 15 miles, okay. 150, not so much. I would say that if we are going to have a credible eyewitness and all of this other information, why would we pick so far away, right? Why would we make that up as Carl, Jeff Osiadich? Why would we choose so far away? And so my feeling is that the flight had to go a path that was lower, because the plane was supposed to fly low and slow, and that Carl was able to take out pilot maps and trace the appropriate path, and that the real path wasn't given out because Walt was already being groomed to work for Vanell and to go overseas. And so that's a theory, though. I have to be honest, I cannot prove it, but someday I hope I can. I don't know. I would love a former Vanell employee who worked with my uncle on the dam to reach out to me if there's anybody still out there. I have had people from his, the union and his union fight right before the hijacking, which is why I think he's named Cooper. The union leader, Henry Cooper, threatened his life. He thinks almost took his baby's life, So that person reached out to me and said he had gone with my uncle to a safe deposit box in Canada and had seen gold bars and gold coins and all of that. And this was in the late 1980s after he got back from overseas. So
that's pretty wild.
I know. So he could verify that story.
One thing I think is funny of the people who dismissed Reca, when they're like, oh yeah, that's way outside the flight path, but I'm a fan of the Western flight path. It's like you could debate the flight path, but someone who says it was outside of it, they're automatically wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I never quite understood that. And, there is a witness account. So if Reca, fine, let's say he's not Cooper, what was he doing falling out of the sky in Clay Elm that night?
Right. In a suit. In a suit and loafers. Oh, another thing that Jeff Osiadich said, and I don't know if you've ever spoken to him yourself, but he said he remembers my uncle's shoes because he always wanted a pair of loafers like that. And, he always had work boots and stuff and no place to wear nice shoes. And so he noticed my uncle's shoes. The other thing I really feel strongly about this other topic. One of the things that Walt said he did is he handed Don Brennan, when he picked him up, 2 or 3 packs of money, said, here, and now keep your mouth shut, right? Because now you're implicated, but also thanks for picking me up. Here's money for your trouble, but also keep your mouth shut. In the FBI interviews, and I have the exact ones written down, the head of the bank security where the money came from said that the money had bank type bands with First Seattle Bank, another bank name, and other banks. And they named the other bank, I just don't remember what it is, printed on it. And that was the money they delivered. Tina Mucklow said when the hijacker was going through the bag of money, it was wrapped in bank type bands. And then that's when she was trying to joke with him and he handed her a package of the money. She is not a bank employee. She would not call it bank type bands if it was wrapped in rubber bands. She would say it was wrapped in rubber bands. If she saw rubber bands, she would say rubber bands. She's a flight attendant. But she said bank type bands. Everybody knows what those are, those paper bands. The Tina Bar money was found stacked on top of each other, wrapped in rubber bands. And I really feel like people discount that as evidence. And whether you think that was the money Don Brennan had and he wanted to get rid of it because it had, the serial numbers were tracked and he was afraid he'd be found. And then maybe he's like, oh, or maybe he buried it in his backyard and it deteriorated. So now he's like, hey, telling the Ingrams, go find this money and we can share the FBI reward. I don't know. That's my theory. And my guess is that that money at least proves, whether or not you believe Walt is DB Cooper, that money proves that money was repackaged when it made it to Earth. It was repackaged in rubber bands because the bank's head of security said it was in paper bands with certain printing on it. And Tina Mucklow said it when it was on the plane. It was in bank type bands. And I didn't even realize this till I read an article recently. The banks often had money put aside for ransoms, right? So that they could pull it right away. And they had it already, the serial numbers already on microfilm. And it didn't make sense to me when I was reading the FBI paperwork, why it said, here's the microfilm, only look at these numbers, don't look at the other numbers. That's for the other $30,000 or $50,000. And I was like, I thought they only gave him $200,000. Well, now I put two and two together. They only gave $200,000, but they gave a microfilm for the $250,000 that they had put onto the microfilm. They didn't have to take the money apart, count it, microfilm it, put it back together and deliver it to the plane. They didn't have time to do that with, what was that, $10,000, $20 bills? They didn't have time to do that in an hour or two. It was already done, which means that when they say that it was in paper bands, it was in paper bands because it had already been prepped and repackaged by the bank. So that to me is a really important point to proving Cooper survived the jump, I think. And for me, Don Brennan lived at about the time the Tina Bar money was found, he lived about an hour and a half north of Tina Bar. So he lived, I think it's Olympia, which is directly north of there.
Yeah, I've always thought that was a really interesting thing. Cooper asks for $200,000 and they go get this money from the bank where they had $250,000 set aside for such an occasion.
Right.
Do you think Walt knew that there was money they had set aside? Or do you think he just was like, hey, 200,000 sounds good?
Walt had a lot of friends in a lot of different areas. It's possible he knew, like he had a friend who worked at a bank. I know I asked him once. One of his aliases was James Allen O'Brennan. And I said, who's that? When I was reading his confession, he said, he's a bank robber. And I was like, a bank robber? When did you rob a bank? Like, what? But I don't know if he was just kidding or tying that together, but maybe that, and again, I can't tie that to anything, but I would put it past Walt to know somebody who worked at a bank who would have told him that they had money set aside already for ransom, for kidnapping. You can't, if you got a kidnapping and they need $200,000, a lot of times banks, if it's a smaller bank in a smaller community, they may not have that much in their vaults, right? So you have to have it and be able to pull it quickly. I would say something that Vern said about the flight path being done out of Sacramento. There's a heavy CIA presence in Sacramento, and his book is going to come out early in January about the investigation.
Vern's
and
book?
About Carl. Yeah, Vern Jones has written a book, and I guess it's about how they track down these stories to try to verify Carl's story and Walt's story and the whole process of verifying the story and why they think it's Walt. But according to Vernon, and this is according to his research, I don't have direct knowledge of this, but Sacramento has a heavy CIA presence, and that's where Northwest Airlines and where the plane was directed from was out of Sacramento, which is uncommon for a plane coming out of Seattle.
All right. Now, if I could speak to Vern real quick. Why am I just hearing about this now, Vern? Why didn't you tell me, bro?
I'm sure he'd be happy to come on and talk to you about his latest venture.
All right. Was Walt's bomb real?
No, I don't think so. He said it was not. He said it was flares and a battery, but no. I do not think that Walt would have wanted to kill anybody on that plane. And I don't think he probably ever thought twice about the mental anguish he caused anybody on that plane. I really don't think he thought about it twice after he survived. He just moved on with his life. However, when they were on the ground, if the plane had been stormed, I don't think he would have sat there either. So people could have gotten hurt, right? He had a violent past. Would he have just they stormed the plane? He would not have gone to jail. He would not have been taken alive. And in not being taken alive, somebody else could have died or gotten hurt. So, but I don't think he, just like he said when he robbed the Bob's Big Boy, he took in a machine gun, but he said it was empty. So to avoid, he didn't want to accidentally get nervous and press a trigger and shoot his own foot or shoot somebody else. He really didn't want to hurt people. He just wanted the money. He always saw it as he's taking from the corporation. He was robbing a plane. Northwest Airlines paid insurance money. The insurance company would be the one that would fork over the ransom, and have to cover the ransom. So Northwest was getting their money's worth on their insurance payments. Is that how he looked at it? Right. And that's how he looked at the Big Boy robbery. They had insurance for this stuff. They were going to get paid anyway. So he wasn't really robbing. He was doing everybody a service, right? That's how you explain it away.
Lisa, what do you need to prove to everyone without a doubt you were right all along?
It probably would have to take somebody from the FBI to say it was Walt. Not that everybody else would believe it. They might think it was, I think today's day and age, we're all so caught up in conspiracies. And that's probably because there are conspiracies that are proven true, right? So then it makes sense that other things we can't explain could be a conspiracy. For me, I think it's the FBI saying, yes, it was him. The CIA would never say anything. Vanell would never say anything, right? Because they wouldn't want to be tied to something like that. Maybe Northwest Airlines, if there was a transcript and we could prove the flight path did go that. I think if you can prove the flight path and we have the eyewitness and the landing spot, I think that would tie it together and help me convince other people, right?
Why do you think so many people have confessed?
It's become folklore and romantic. And that's why I think it's really important. There's, I think, a movie coming out featuring Tina Mucklow and her story, because one of the things that's recorded on the tape with Carl is that he talks about when he handed Florence Schaffner the note saying, "I'm hijacking the plane." Carl was asking him questions like, what were you thinking? Or what, and he said something like, and he asked her, what did she say? And he goes, she just looked at me. She just stared at me. He goes, I think she was as afraid, as upset and afraid as I was, or something along that line, right? I think we forget there were victims in this story. And I think about Tina Mucklow. She was how calm. Florence lost it. She couldn't even speak. She was just mouthing. All she could get out was Tina when Tina came up to her, because she could tell something was going on. And she dropped the note. Tina picked it up. Florence Schaffner went up to the cockpit and relayed the demands, right? And then Tina sat down and next to the hijacker and kept him calm and was the go-between, to the point where several people on the plane didn't even know it was being hijacked until after they got off, right? And her presence of mind and she wasn't trained for that, I wouldn't think, but she was younger than my youngest daughter is now. And so I think about my 24-year-old daughter being in that situation and how horrible it was. And she talked about how she didn't break down until afterwards. She had to have had nightmares. She didn't know if the bomb was real or not. They had to assume it was. They didn't know what would possibly set him off. So from their perspective, the story's never been told from the victim's point of view. And I'm really glad the story's coming out, because I do think it's easy to romanticize the story. And that goes back to your question. I think that's why so many people have come out and said, I'm the person, or I think my friend is. There was somebody, I created a Facebook page called DB Cooper Story for my last name Story. So I could share some of the stuff about my uncle and pictures and photos and clips of his letters and all of that. And somebody just started posting like all of these pictures that their dad looks like Cooper, but it's a sketch I've never seen before. It's not an official FBI sketch. I'm like, I don't know where that sketch came from, but he's just posting everything. And I'm like, you know what? You need to join the DB Cooper mystery group, because that's where all the experts are and they can talk to you about your theories. I just know my uncle's story. I really do not know anybody else's story. I think a lot of these more credible suspects are very interesting people, and I can see why people put them together. But I don't know what, maybe at this point, they don't think they'll go to jail. Obviously, the reason we didn't come out is we thought my uncle would go to jail. So we didn't come forward because we thought he really, truly, there was enough credible evidence he would go to jail. Then I was afraid when we were sitting on it that I would go to jail for accessory to a crime, because I never came forward. So you asked me that earlier, what I was thinking. And I was thinking, do I go to the FBI or not? And then when I did, right, they didn't even want to hear about it. They just said, no, thank you. Case closed.
I guess you didn't need to be nervous, right?
I know, right? Hiding things in my house, oh no.
All right, let me ask you a weird question now. Why does this case and DB Cooper appeal more to men than women? At CooperCon, if you looked around the room, mostly dudes. If you go on the forums to talk DB Cooper, almost exclusively dudes. If I look at my audience, if I look at the people who follow me on Twitter or Facebook, the vast majority, over 90% men. Why is that?
Okay, this is junk science. I think it's because men look at it of, how would I have done this? Could I have gotten away with it? I parachute. He was polite. He didn't run around threatening people's lives. So they look at it from the criminal aspect. Was he an expert parachutist or was he an amateur? And they look at it from the mystery and the solving. Women probably take it more from looking at the victim's side, maybe. And that's not so funny. I always say when a man and a woman get in an argument, the man will just throw the glass and smash it. The woman will go to throw it, but then go, oh, darn it. Then the liquid will go everywhere. And then I got to sweep it up. And then probably when I'm walking barefoot, I'm going to step on the glass. And so they think about those what ifs and the what afters and think that through. I think, and that means that women would think through, how did the crew feel? Like, they must have been terrified. And so maybe they don't romanticize it as much as the guys do. That's just my guess. I really don't know. It is an interesting question, because when you look at some of these like wine and crime podcasts and unsolved mysteries and all of that, there are a lot of women involved in that and interested in that, but they're not interested in this story.
Yeah, I have a friend that does a pretty big podcast and a true crime one. And I asked him and he said, dude, my audience is probably 75% female.
Really?
And I was like, well, my audience is 90% dudes. And I just find that so interesting.
And maybe there's something a little even heroic about somebody just, getting away with it and jumping out of the back of the plane, and men putting themselves in that position. Like, if I did this, how would I do that? Or I want to solve this. I don't know. It's a really good question.
I liked your answer.
Okay, good.
All right. My next question. So Why don't you think your story, the Walter Reca story, gets the attention that it deserves?
I think there are two things. I think still the public perception of what the flight path is and how legitimate it is, which I do think that it's not the flight path that was flown. But I think people are like, it's a done deal. It's just too far away. And I also feel like those of us who are involved, we're not trying to become celebrities. And we're not trying to make Walt a celebrity. And I know that it's like, yeah, but you have these books and these documentaries. Carl really wanted to tell Walt's story. He didn't want him, because it was almost more of what happened afterwards that's more interesting. And the patriotic duty he thought he was serving, but then he really wasn't. He was serving corporate interests. I think Carl wanted that story to get out, and he thought the Cooper story would sell that, right? You know, that would be the hook that people would be interested in. But if you look we're not out there trying to get our own show or anything along that line. And maybe that's why it's died. We're not as enthusiastic. Vern has done a really good job of investigating this and getting credible investigators to look at the evidence. He'll even say I think you've interviewed him before. He'll even say he wasn't even convinced for like 2 years. He wanted proof. He wanted to talk to Jeff Osiadich himself. He didn't want to just take Carl's word for it. He wanted to talk to me himself. He, and all of these things. And he wanted to know, am I a crackpot or not? So I don't know. But does it matter? I guess it doesn't really matter. I'm just proud of myself. I actually finished something and I have the story put together. Like I said, you and I will probably be the only people who read it in my family, but I finished it. And it's a tribute to my uncle and I think I still am really interested in tracking down more about his mercenary years.
All right. So we've got D.B. Cooper and Me by Carl Lauren. Getting the Truth, I Am D.B. Cooper by Joe Koenig. We have Vern's upcoming book, Breaking News from Lisa Story. When can we expect your book?
I hope by spring. I'm going through and editing myself, and then I need to get an editor. And then I'll, like I said, then I have to figure out how to publish it because I don't have a lot of money and extra money to do this. So, and that costs some money. So it's when I can save up enough, right? But mine is going to be called Better Off Dead Than Poor.
I love the name.
Thank you. Stories and Letters from D.B. Cooper. Because they had some crazy parachute stories. Loretta talks about when she met Carl. She met Carl through Walt and his wife, Joni. And so Joni invited her out to the Saginaw airfield where they did these weekend shows and people started coming out. Well, Carl was trying to impress her. So he did something that a lot of them did at that time is they'd wait till the last possible second to pull their chute. So she thought he was going to die and he pulled his chute just, he said a few feet off the ground, but it's probably like 100 feet off the ground or something. And when he walked over to her and like, hi, because he knew that they were being set up, she was like, you're a real jerk. And she walked away from him. So she tells that story. It's really funny and everything. But they just had those fun stories that are about an era of men that we don't hear about. And they were heroes in their own right. Patriots, even if they were criminals, they were patriots still. They believed in their country. They fought for their country. My uncle and I had a whole debate about Kent State. He thought those students deserved to die because they threw rocks at the National Guard. I'm like, my daughter was in college, my oldest at the time, and had gone to a protest about, and I said, what if somebody had thrown a rock at the police officers and they shot her, and she wasn't even the one who threw the rock. And he's like, well, yeah, I can see what you're saying. But he got very angry because he also felt, I said, there were students walking to class and just got hit by the fire. They had nothing to do with the protest. And I think he saw them as draft dodgers. They were in college, so they didn't have to go to Vietnam. And, he just was very like hardcore when it came to that. So we had some interesting conversations, and I have some of those in the book,
Well, if you're listening to this after spring of 2022, make sure you pick up Lisa's book, Better Off Dead Than Poor.
Yeah.
All right, Lisa, have we missed anything?
I think we covered everything. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed meeting you at CooperCon. I recognized your voice first. I was like, are you Darren? So it was great to put a face with a name.
Yeah, it was great to meet you too. I think this is the first podcast I've done where I met someone in person and then did a remote interview. So that's a little bit backwards.
Okay.
But yeah, I wanted to do it in person. I brought all my podcast gear, but you left a little bit earlier than me and I was pretty busy that weekend. But
yeah,
I'm glad we were able to get together and do this. Lisa, you are wonderful. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. And you were a great panel leader at CooperCon. You did a great job asking questions, really interesting questions too, questions I didn't anticipate. And so you were great. I hope you are there in the future too.
Yeah, I'll see you next year, right?
Yeah, probably.
All right, look for me and Lisa at CooperCon 2022.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you, Lisa.
If you can't wait for Lisa's book to come out and you need more Walt Reca, I'd recommend watching D.B. Cooper, The Real Story. It's on Amazon. I think I paid like $10 for it. It's 4 45-minute episodes. And if you're listening to this and you haven't watched it, honestly, you are missing out. It's good. There's also the book D.B. Cooper and Me by Carl Lauren and Getting the Truth, I Am D.B. Cooper by Joe Koenig. If you're listening to this in the future, then go look for Lisa's book. Don't forget that as soon as I'm done speaking, you'll hear Darren Osadich sing Money and the Man. Do you have a hot take on this case? Do you have all the answers? Want to come on the show and tell me everyone is wrong? Hit us up. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or email us dbcooperpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you to Lisa Story for letting me eat her leftover pizza at CooperCon. Thank you to Russell Colbert, who also loves leftover pizza. Thank you to Darren Osadich for permission to play his tune on the show. I'm Darren Schaefer, and thank you for listening to the Cooper Vortex.
Here's a story we all know about a man many years ago. Hijacked a plane, so we were told. Then he jumped into the cold. Lights are burning and a cigarette. He's in the air, the stage is set. Polite and kind, the people say it's time to make his getaway. This is how the story goes about the money and the man. D.B. Cooper, they call me now. Catch me if you can. Rolled up in his coat-built tie. He's got enough to change his life. Where he landed, no one knows. But from this tale, a legend grows. Was a cold, dark, rainy night. As he walked, he saw light. Held his cash close to his side. He just needs to catch a ride. This is how the story goes about the money and the man. D.B. Cooper, they call me now. Catch me if you can. Soaking wet down to the bone. Look for a place to use the phone. Little cafe outside of town. He walked in, he just sat down. Met a man with a cowboy hat. told a friend right where he's at. Into the night he disappeared, and from that night a legend reared. This is how the story goes about the money and the man. D.B. Cooper, they call me now. Catch me if you can. 40 years, the secret's out. The story has been told. D.B. Cooper's done running now. He was 80